Watch closely. JustProfessor here. Tell someone a lie once, they don't believe you. Tell them the same lie 10 times. Suddenly it starts feeling true. They're not stupid. Their brain is wired to trust repeated information more than new information. And this is exactly how propaganda works, how brands build loyalty, and how you end up believing things that aren't real. Your brain has a simple rule for determining what's true. If you hear something multiple times, it's probably true. If you only heard it once, it might be wrong. This rule makes sense in normal life where true things get repeated more often than false things. But it creates a massive vulnerability. Repeat anything enough times, and people's brains start treating it as true, regardless of whether it actually is. This is called the repetition effect or the illusory truth effect. The more you hear something, the more true it feels. And that feeling of truth has nothing to do with actual truth. The repetition effect is when repeated exposure to information makes it feel more true, even when it's false. You hear a claim once, you're skeptical. You hear the same claim 5 times, it starts feeling familiar. You hear it 10 times, it starts feeling true. Your brain interprets familiarity as a signal of truth. The more familiar something feels, the more your brain assumes it must be accurate. This happens automatically, below conscious awareness. The problem is, this mechanism doesn't check whether the repeated information is actually true. It only checks whether you've encountered it before. A lie repeated 10 times will feel more true than a fact you heard once. Your brain, its familiarity detector, can't distinguish between truth that's been repeated and lies that have been repeated. It just registers how many times you've encountered the information and adjusts your feeling of truth accordingly. This creates a dangerous vulnerability to manipulation. Anyone who controls what information you're exposed to repeatedly can shape what feels true to you. Advertisers repeat brand messages until they feel like facts. Politicians repeat talking points until they feel like reality. Media outlets repeat narratives until they feel like the obvious truth. Your feeling of truth is being manufactured through repetition, and you think you're just recognizing what's real. What makes this effect particularly insidious is that you don't need to believe something the first time you hear it for repetition to work. Even if you consciously reject a claim as false, repeated exposure will gradually make it feel more true. Your conscious skepticism gets worn down by your brain's automatic processing of familiarity. Eventually, the repeated lie starts feeling more plausible than it should, even though you know better intellectually. Let me show you how the repetition effect shapes your beliefs without you realizing it. The research on this is disturbing. Scientists showed people statements that were either true or false. Some statements appeared once. Others appeared multiple times across different sessions. Later, people rated how true each statement felt. Statements they'd seen multiple times felt significantly more true than statements they'd seen once. This happened even for statements that were objectively false. Repetition made lies feel true. The really disturbing part is this effect worked even when people were explicitly told the statements might be false. Knowing that some information was unreliable didn't protect them from the repetition effect. Their brains still interpreted repeated exposure as a signal of truth. Conscious awareness that they might be manipulated wasn't enough to override the automatic processing that equates familiarity with truth. Advertising is built entirely on the repetition effect. Companies don't run an ad once. They run it hundreds of times. You see the same message, the same slogan, the same brand association over and over. Eventually, claims that started as marketing feel like facts. Red Bull gives you wings feels true, even though it obviously doesn't literally give you wings. Just do it feels meaningful, even though it's meaningless. Got milk feels like important health advice, even though it's just advertising. Repetition turned marketing messages into things that feel true. Brand loyalty comes largely from the repetition effect. You see a brand name repeatedly. It becomes familiar. Familiarity feels good. You start preferring the familiar brand over unfamiliar ones. This preference feels like it's based on quality or rational choice. Actually, it's based on repetition. The brand you've seen most often feels most trustworthy, not because it's better, but because repetition created false familiarity that your brain interpreted as endorsement. Political propaganda uses the repetition effect as its primary tool. A politician repeats the same talking points in every speech, every interview, every debate. The points might be misleading or false, but after hearing them dozens of times, they start feeling true to people. The repetition makes the claims familiar. Familiarity makes them feel credible. People who initially dismiss the claims eventually find themselves thinking there might be something to them. That's repetition overriding their critical thinking. News media accidentally amplifies lies through repetition. A false claim gets made. News outlets report on the claim, debunking it. But in the process of debunking, they repeat the false claim over and over. People see the false claim in headlines, in article text, in broadcasts. The repetition makes the false claim more familiar. Even though the coverage was trying to correct the lie, the repeated exposure to the lie itself made it feel more true to many viewers. Social media makes the repetition effect more powerful than ever. Your feed shows you the same messages repeatedly. Posts get shared and reshared. You see the same claim from multiple friends. Each exposure increases familiarity. Your brain interprets this as social proof and truth. Misinformation spreads because the repetition effect makes lies feel true faster than fact-checking can debunk them. By the time correction arrives, the lie already feels familiar and therefore plausible. Conspiracy theories thrive on the repetition effect. A false theory gets repeated within a community. Members see it in forums, videos, conversations. The constant repetition makes it feel increasingly true. When outsiders present contradicting evidence, it feels unfamiliar and therefore suspicious. The conspiracy theory has been repeated so many times that it feels more true than actual facts that the person hasn't been exposed to as much. Education sometimes accidentally teaches through repetition rather than understanding. Students hear the same facts repeatedly until they memorize them. They feel true because they're familiar. But the students might not understand them. They just recognize them from repetition. This creates the illusion of knowledge when really there's just familiarity built through repeated exposure. Personal relationships involve repetition effects too. Someone repeatedly tells you that you're not good at something. At first you disagree, but after hearing it many times it starts feeling true. The repetition has made the criticism familiar. Your brain mistakes familiarity for accuracy. You begin believing negative things about yourself simply because you've heard them repeatedly, not because they're actually true. So how do you fight the repetition effect when your brain automatically treats familiar information as true? How do you avoid believing lies just because you've heard them multiple times? First, recognize that feeling something is true is not the same as it actually being true. Your sense of truth is heavily influenced by familiarity. Things feel true because you've heard them before, not necessarily because they're accurate. Separate the feeling of truth from actual truth. Second, actively check information that feels obviously true. The things that feel most true are often the things you've been exposed to most. That feeling is a red flag, not confirmation. When something feels undeniably true, that's when you most need to verify it rather than trust your gut. Third, be suspicious of repeated messages. When you notice you're hearing the same claim over and over, recognize this as an attempt to use the repetition effect. The repetition is trying to make you feel the claim is true through familiarity. Resist by consciously noting that repetition is different from evidence. Fourth, diversify your information sources. If you only consume media from similar sources, you'll hear the same claims repeated, making them feel true through repetition. Different sources expose you to different claims, preventing any single narrative from feeling exclusively true through repetition dominance. Fifth, consciously remember that you've been wrong before about things that felt obviously true. This humility helps counteract the confidence that repetition creates. Just because something feels undeniably true doesn't mean it is. You felt certain before and been wrong. You'll feel certain again and be wrong. The feeling proves nothing. Sixth, look for evidence rather than relying on gut feelings. Your gut feeling about truth is compromised by the repetition effect. Don't trust whether something feels true. Check whether there's actual evidence for it. Evidence is less vulnerable to manipulation through repetition than feelings are. Seventh, be aware that simply hearing corrections isn't enough. When false information gets repeated more than corrections, the false information will feel more true even if you know the corrections. Actively remind yourself of the corrections to build familiarity with accurate information that can compete with the familiarity of lies. The repetition effect means repeated exposure to information makes it feel more true, regardless of whether it actually is true. Your brain uses familiarity as a proxy for truth. The more times you encounter a claim, the more familiar it becomes. The more familiar it becomes, the more true it feels. This creates a direct path from repetition to belief that bypasses truth entirely. This effect is dangerous because it works on everyone automatically. You don't have to initially believe something for repetition to make it feel true later. You don't have to trust the source. You don't have to lack critical thinking skills. Simply hearing something multiple times is enough to increase your sense that it's true. Your brain's automatic familiarity processing overrides your conscious skepticism. The modern information environment weaponizes this effect constantly. Advertisers repeat messages until brand claims feel like facts. Politicians repeat talking points until lies feel true. Social media repeats misinformation until it feels more credible than corrections. Anyone who can control what information you're exposed to repeatedly can shape what feels true to you. Your beliefs are being manufactured through repetition. Fighting the repetition effect requires recognizing that your feelings about what's true are unreliable. Things feel true because they're familiar, not because they're accurate. When something feels obviously true, that's your cue to verify it rather than trust it. When you notice repetition, recognize it as manipulation rather than confirmation. Diversify your information sources to prevent any single narrative from dominating through repetition. You can't eliminate your brain's tendency to equate familiarity with truth, but you can become aware of it and compensate for it. Check things that feel obviously true. Be suspicious of repeated messages. Look for evidence instead of trusting gut feelings. Remember that feeling certain doesn't make you correct. The repetition effect will keep trying to trick you into believing lies. Your job is to notice when repetition is replacing truth with familiarity. Subscribe to learn how else your brain gets manipulated without you knowing.